So I hope everybody's doing well this morning. Just a quick reminder of where we are in this series. By now, we've taken a look at all of the biblical references to a prohibition on intermarriage. We took a look at the very few sources that exist in the Torah. And we spent last week talking about what might have motivated Ezra and Nehemiah, the leaders of the Jewish community who return, remember, from the Babylonian exile. They return with a small community of Jews and make this issue, intermarriage, into a major point of religious concern for them in rebuilding Jewish society uh, in the Second Temple period. We looked at their very lengthy and passionate sermons, Ezra and Nehemiah, and the covenant that they asked people to make so that um, they would divorce their foreign wives and promise not to give their children, of course, to foreign wives or foreign husbands. Ezra and Nehemiah are very clear about this. They don't seem to really care if the foreign person is from the seven Canaanite nations, because there are no seven Canaanite nations at that point. Uh, they extend their prohibition to all of the idol worshiping nations surrounding them. Now, we thought a little bit last week about what might have motivated Ezra and Nehemiah to make this such an important issue. And something I threw out there, I obviously I can't prove this, but a theory that I would put out there is that this is a community that is recovering from trauma. The Babylonian exile was traumatic, and a community recovering from trauma is paranoid about the religious integrity of the people, paranoid about the future, their survival, and really concerned about uh, the fact that they are a remnant, which is a word that we found. I think it was Ezra who used that word, the remnant. And the remnant has to take care of itself because you're such a small slice of what ought to be, what used to be. So the remnant has a responsibility because of the time that it's living in that is greater than the responsibility of those who might have lived in another time. That's one thought that perhaps motivated Ezra to issue this severe decree against intermarriage. The other thing that I wanted everyone to notice is how much time Ezra and Nehemiah um, speak about, is how often they speak about intermarriage in the same context as the priesthood. Why is that important? Because the priesthood, Levitical priesthood, the Leviim, or the Aaronic priesthood, the Kohanim, they have a sacred lineage. They're the remnant of a remnant, and even they're intermarrying. So I wanted us to notice how the two issues, which really are not related, intermarriage and priesthood, become very much intertwined in the way these are presented um, by Ezra and Nehemiah. And I think that has a lot to teach us about um, what evolved in the foresuing centuries because of uh, this idea that we have to protect the bloodline, that Jews have a certain special physiological characteristic, like a Kohen, like a Levi, that needs to be protected. And the more mixing there is, the more diluted that sacred status becomes. Today, We're post biblical. We're dealing with the period after the Bible has been written, but before the Mishnah. The Mishnah, which is the foundational book of rabbinic literature, edited in about 200. We're not there yet. We're dealing with 4 or 5 centuries between the canonization of the Bible, that is when the Jewish Bible becomes closed, and we have the works of rabbinic and Judaism beginning with the Mishnah. So some of these books might not be familiar to you, and it's not a bad idea maybe after class if you'd like to Google, for instance, Philo, who was Philo, what book this is, and we could spend the whole class talking about the history of all of these very interesting works, which were preserved um, by the church until they were later found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So these are not books that have sacred status in the sense that they're canonical, that they're part of sacred Jewish literature, but they were sacred when it comes to the church. The church wanted to preserve some memory of what was going on in the Second Temple period for obvious reasons. And uh, the problem is they often didn't preserve it in the original Aramaic, right? It would be a Greek or a Latin translation until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which helped us. We didn't find all of the books, but some important passages in the original Aramaic. So let's start today with the book of Jubilees. The book of Jubilees is a retelling of the Bible that dates from the Second Temple period. And the book of Jubilees um, says something quite remarkable about intermarriage that sheds light on how Jews living in the time of the Second Temple understood their responsibility to marry or their prohibition to marry the people around them. So let me see here. I'm going to share my screen. Let's first do that. Can you all give me a thumbs up if you can see what's on your screens? Okay, great. And Brenda, can I call on you? Would you mind to read for us? It's a long source, and I'm going to interrupt frequently.
Okay.
So forgive me, but can I call on you, please,
Yes.
to read
Can
for us from the
okay.
30th chapter of the book of Jubilees?
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, terrific. Um, and if there is any man who wishes in Israel to give his daughter or his sister to any man who is the seed of the Gentiles, he shall surely die, and they shall stone him with stones, for hath wrought shame in Israel. And they shall burn the woman with fire, because she has dishonored the name of the house of her father, and she shall be rooted out of Israel.
Now, this is pretty crazy. The book of Jubilees, this is addressed to a Jewish audience, not only says that intermarriage is forbidden, but it says that it is a capital crime to give your daughter or your sister to a non Jew. And again, there's no mention of the 7 nations. Any non Jew, surely that man who is responsible for that union shall die. And not just that, but the woman, the daughter or the sister herself, she has to die too. Now, where do you get this from? Why? How can it be that a Jewish court would order death in a situation like this? We have not yet seen any text in the Torah that would command such a terrible punishment, right? I mean, if you're going to kill somebody, you have to have some grounding in the Torah, some grounding in a religious text, some source to justify such a terrible crime. So, how is it that Second Temple Jews instituted this terrible punishment when there's no source to validate it? So, Brenda, let's see.
And to this law there is no limit of days, and no remission, nor any atonement. But the man who has defiled his daughter shall be rooted out in the midst of all of Israel, because he has given of his seed to Moloch, and has wrought impiously so as to defile it.
So now we have our answer. He has given of his seed to Moloch. Now, why is that our answer? Well, remember earlier, I think it was 2 classes ago, I shared with you that in the book of Leviticus, there's a section called the Holiness Code. And in that section, all of the forbidden relationships are listed. And at that time, I said to you, you it is strange that in that section, nowhere does it say you can't give your daughter or your sister to a non-Jewish man, right? And if that was, if we really believe that there was a prohibition against intermarriage from early on in the Bible, it would likely be listed in that section. But there is a law in that section saying it's forbidden to give your daughter over to Moloch. Now, who is or what is Moloch? Well, according to most translations of the Bible, Moloch is some idol, it's some foreign deity, some pagan deity. And the intent of the Torah in prohibiting giving your daughter over to Moloch was to uh, was to prohibit almost child sacrifice, right? Giving one of your children over to a foreign god that would demand the sacrifice of a child. That is a capital punishment according to the Torah, but not according to Jubilees. Jubilees says, properly stood, the Bible, when it says don't give your child over to Moloch, is actually saying don't give your child over to a non Jew. It is a prohibition against intermarriage, the giving of your seed to Moloch, which is a dramatically different reading than than what might have assumed, and it explains why we come to this terrible punishment, where we get this terrible punishment from in the book of Jubilees. Why is it that you have to die and she has to die? Well, because you violated one of the rules in the Holiness Code, which are very, very serious rules. It's just that you violated it in the way that Jubilees understands that you violated it, not in the way I think you or I would have assumed had we just been reading this chapter and going through it ourselves. Or, by the way, as other traditional Jewish sources understand this prohibition. So that helps us understand where this comes from. Let's keep going, Brenda.
And do thou, Moses, command the children of Israel and exhort them not to give their daughters to the Gentiles, and not to take for their sons any of the daughters of the Gentiles, for this is abominable before the Lord. For
Now,
this
again, where does Moses command the children of Israel not to give their daughters to Gentiles? Where does this happen? Right? Well, we don't know. Not in the Torah we have does Moses make such an announcement. Right? He says 7 nations, but um, that's it. Unless we're missing something. Maybe we are. Brenda, keep going.
For this reason I have written for thee in the words of the law all the deeds of the Shechemites, which they wrought against Dinah, and how the sons of Jacob spake, saying, we will not give our daughter to a man who is uncircumcised, for that were a reproach unto us. And it is a reproach to Israel, to those who live, and to those that take the daughters of the Gentiles. For this is an unclean and abominable to Israel.
So where does um, Jubilees get the idea from that Moses forbade intermarriage? he gets it from not a law in the Torah, he gets it from the stories in the Torah. There's one story that he quotes here. Some of you might be familiar with the story of the rape of Dinah. The rape of Dinah, I think we just read it a few weeks ago in Shul. And remember, um, the sons of Jacob were very, very angry with the Shechemites. They wanted to go to war against them because they raped Dinah, right? Now that's a story of raping. It's not a story of intermarriage, but Jubilees again with a different reading of what's going on there says no, it's not the rape that really bothered the sons of Jacob. It was the fact that she was taken as a wife from among the daughters of the Gentiles. Now, if you think about it, it's so obvious. Who does one expect Dinah to marry? There are no other all the other Jewish men are her brothers, right? We're talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and his 12 sons. Where are the other Jewish men? So it's sort of like, where is Jubilees getting this from? It's so, but whatever, you can't ask those questions. You just say, Jubilees wanted to make a point. The point is that the Bible, properly understood, forbids intermarriage, and that we learn that not only from the Holiness Code, where it talks about not giving over your seed to Moloch, but we also learn it from the anecdotal portions of the Torah, the stories like the raping of Dinah, which convey a discomfort with um, Jewish girls or Jewish boys intermingling with the locals, right? It's just that he changes it here. The book of Jubilees changes it from the locals to the Gentiles. Go ahead, Brenda, keep going.
And Israel will not be free from this uncleanliness if it has a wife of the daughters of the Gentiles, or has given any of its daughters to a man who is of any of the Gentiles.
So notice this word again I think we should highlight: uncleanliness or uncleanness. Again, when we're trying to think of reasons for, as I said in the first class we took, we always have to ask why. Why the prohibition against intermarriage? And so these words pop out at us as possible explanations, possible rationale. There is something unclean about a non Jewish man, a man who is uncircumcised, who takes a Jewish woman as his wife. Go ahead, Brenda, for there.
For there will be plague upon plague and curse upon curse, and every judgment and plague and curse will come, if he do this thing or hide his eyes from those who commit uncleanliness, or those who defile the sanctuary of the Lord, or those who profane his holy name. Then the whole nation together be judged for all the uncleanliness and profanation of this man. And there will be no respect.
So notice, remember, look at the grouping. What uncleanness is grouped here with defiling the sanctuary and profaning God's name. Those three are grouped together, which I think teaches us how the book of Jubilees understood intermarriage, that it was related to profaning God's name, defiling the sanctuary. I think uncleanness in general, that's the fear of the Jubilees. There is something about the Gentiles that brings in tum'ah. Now, some of you, I can't help as I'm reading this, but think of the story of Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah is the story of the defiling of the sanctuary. The Second Temple period already is the Greco Roman period. And the Greco Roman period, they had a religion which violated, um, not only violated many of the religious tenets of Judaism, but they had a religion or a culture, one might say, that was very open to receiving Jewish converts, right? It's not even converts because there's no formal conversion to Hellenism. It was just a culture that was open in general, and many Jews, as we learn from the story of Hanukkah, were brought to Hellenic practices and Hellenic beliefs, and the distinctions between the Hellenized Jew and the Hellenized Gentile start to become a little murky. We even have evidence of Hellenized Jews who are no longer circumcising, right? So, what is the difference then between the Hellenized Jew and the Hellenized Gentile? So, it's possible that Jubilees sees these as one and the same. It is about Hellenism coming to defile Judaism. And thus, again, this becomes a religious battle. This is not about intermarriage per se, perhaps. It is about defending Judaism from the uncleanness of the Gentiles, and that is an uncleanness that materializes in defiling the sanctuary, in profaning God's name, and also in intermarriage, because these things wipe out the distinction between Jews and non-Jews, and that's exactly what the Hellenists have in mind, right? To wipe out those distinctions, and maybe that's why um, Jubilees take such an aggressive stance here. Go ahead, Brenda.
And there will be no respect of persons, and no consideration of persons, and no receiving at his hands of fruits and offerings, and burnt offerings and fat, nor the fragrance of sweet savor, so as to accept it, and so fare every man or woman in Israel who defiles the sanctuary. For this reason I have commanded thee, saying, testify this testimony to Israel. See how the Shechemites fared and their sons, how they were delivered into the hands of two sons of Jacob, and they slew them under tortures, and it was reckoned unto them for righteousness, and it is written down to them for righteousness. And the seed of Levi was chosen for the priesthood, and to be Levites, that they might minister before the Lord, as we continually, and that the Levi and his sons may be blessed forever. For he was zealous to execute righteousness and judgment and vengeance on all those who arose against Israel.
So again, thank you, Brenda. So again, we find an anecdotal evidence for the ban against intermarriage, right? He learns it, the book of Jubilees, from what happened with Dinah and the Shechemites. And also, lo and behold, again, this connection to the priesthood and the Levites. It's almost like the book of Jubilees is saying, Levi, who was the brother who took out his aggression against the Shechemites to defend Dinah's honor, that Levi, who defended the integrity and the cleanness of his sister, was chosen eternally to have his seed protected, and and that was his reward, right? That Levi and his sons and the priesthood, they would also be protected just as he protected his sister. So it all comes together for the book of Jubilees in a way where it sees very clearly that the Bible, as properly understood, forbids intermarriage from the days of the patriarchs, from the days of the patriarchs. Now, what would he say about Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Doesn't even mention Ezra and Nehemiah. That's a pretty big question, don't you all think? Like, if you're saying to me at the beginning, Book of Jubilees, that she's got to die and he's got to die, and that's in Leviticus, that was ordained from the beginning. Well, why didn't Ezra and Nehemiah kill everybody? Why didn't they kill the daughters and kill the husbands and go on a shooting spree against everybody who had intermarried? So maybe the only answer is, well, Ezra and Nehemiah had different rules because they were operating at a different time, right? They were operating at a time when the Jewish people was just starting to rebuild itself after the Babylonian exile, so they needed to follow special rules and make special exceptions to the rules. Who knows? But that is a big question that casts, I think, a lot of historical doubt on what Jubilees is asserting. If it's so clear that anybody who intermarries has got to die, and anybody responsible for that intermarriage has got to die, well, we've got a lot of evidence that people weren't listening to that, or maybe people were just not respecting the rules as understood. Well, thank you, Brenda. I think we learn a lot from the Book of Jubilees that gives us some context about the fear of intermarriage in the Greco-Roman context. It is of boundaries being erased. Okay. Alice, may I ask you to unmute? Josephus is a source that you might be more familiar with.
Josephus.
Josephus retells the stories of the Bible, including the story of Solomon and his many wives that we saw. I think it was the first week of our class, the danger of Solomon's wives leading him astray. So let's see how Josephus retells the story of Solomon. Go ahead, Alice.
Okay, it cuts off a little at the right, but you can fill it in. But although Solomon was become the most glorious of kings and the best beloved by
God,
and had exceeded in wisdom and riches those that had been rulers of the Hebrews before, yet did not he preserve in this happy state till he died. He grew mad in his love of women and laid no restraint on himself in his lusts, nor was he satisfied with the women of his country, but he married many wives out of foreign nations, Sidonians and Tyrians and Ammonites, Edomites, and he transgressed the laws of Moses, which forbade Jews to marry anybody but that were of their own people.
Now that's the important sentence that I want to highlight here, that Josephus also understands that within the laws of Moses, i.e., the Torah, there is a prohibition against Jews marrying any but those that were of their own people, not the 7 nations, which the book of Kings, if we go back, let me go back here to the book of Kings when we first week. What does the book of Kings say? They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their God. So the book of Kings clearly emphasizes the fact that Solomon took wives from the prohibited nations. That was the problem. The 7 prohibited nations, because those 7 will turn your heart away. But as Josephus understands or reinterprets the story, what happened to Solomon had nothing to do with the 7 nations. It's that he was actually forbidden to marry to marry anybody except for Jews. And the fact that he intermarried, that was the source of problems. Go ahead, Alice.
He also began to worship their gods, which he did in order the gratification of his wives and out of his affection for them. This very thing our legislature suspected and so admonished us beforehand that we shall not marry women of other nations, other countries, lest we should be entangled with foreign customs and apostatize from our own. We should leave off to honor our own God and should worship their gods.
So this too, I want to emphasize in Josephus. First, thank you, Alice. First, he understands that Solomon's crime had nothing to do with seven nations. It was about marrying non-Jews. But that said, the primary concern that motivated our legislator, who is our legislator? Our legislator is Moses. The primary concern of our legislator is not intermarriage, it's the entanglement with foreign customs. These are words, folks, that we have not seen yet. Entanglement with foreign customs. Notice that in previous sources, we didn't talk about foreign customs, we talked about idolatry. It was religious apostasy that we were worried of, that women would lead their husbands' hearts astray after their own idols. Foreign customs can mean that, but it means much more than that too. And I think takes on even more meaning if you understand, similarly to Jubilees, the Greco-Roman world in which the Jews are inhabiting at this time. Foreign customs. What does that mean? Well, I would propose that it's similar to, let me find it here in Jubilees. It is similar to those who commit uncleanliness, defile the sanctuary of God, or profane his holy name. These are the foreign customs, and probably many, many others that Josephus is worried about. And that is the primary concern, just linguistically for him, more so than intermarriage on its own. It's about leaving off to honor our own God and worshiping their gods, right? Abandoning our faith and going over to theirs. And that is precisely what happened to Solomon. And that, according to Josephus, Moses himself suspected, and that is the whole origin of the prohibition against intermarriage. Thank you, Alice. Okay, now we're going to move to Philo. Lou, would you read? Are you able to read for us from this section from the special laws of Philo? Okay.
Moses commands, do not either form a connection of marriage with one of another nation, and do not be seduced into complying with customs inconsistent with your own, and do stray from the right way and forget the path which leads to piety, turning into a road which is no road.
Okay, so intermarriage here is grouped together with that word again, customs, inconsistent customs, straying from the right way, forgetting the path which leads to piety. It seems to me also for Philo, it's not intermarriage itself that's the primary concern, but that intermarriage results from or leads to an abandonment of the Jewish way of life, whatever that means. Go ahead, Lou, and perhaps.
And perhaps self-resist. If you have been from your earliest youth trained in the best possible instruction which your parents have instilled into you, continually filling your mind with the sacred laws. And the anxiety and fear which parents feel for their sons and daughters is not slight, for perchance they may be allured by mischievous customs instead of genuine good ones. And so they may be in danger of learning to forget the honor belong to the of extreme unhappiness.
Thank you, Lou. Here in Philo, I think we can start talking about that interesting sermon that my colleague Rabbi Sachs gave a couple of years ago, where he talked about the difference between assimilation and intermarriage. For somebody like Philo, clearly, the two go together. I mean, you can let me know if later in our discussion time if you agree with that. But I think it's clear for Philo that it's all one and the same. The anxiety and fear which parents feel for their sons and daughters is not slight. I mean, folks, this could be written in 2021. The anxiety that parents feel, not that their children will intermarry. He doesn't say that. It's that they will be allured by mischievous customs instead of genuine good ones. They're going to assimilate, learning to forget the honor belonging to one God, which will make them extremely unhappy. And marriage is simply part of that road to extreme unhappiness. It is about your sons and your daughters doing whatever they want and not holding fast to the right way. Intermarriage and assimilation are one and the same. It's about the customs that people follow, which ultimately will lead them down the road to disappearance. Philo, of course, is sees the two together, right? They go together. But Rabbi Sachs's speech, if you remember a few years ago, says, is that necessarily true today? Today, are people intermarrying because they are leaving Judaism? Not leaving, and are people who are leaving Judaism intermarrying, right? Conversely, no, there's many people who don't consider themselves really Jewish in any way, but they accept for heritage, but marry somebody Jewish. So he was saying, Rabbi Sachs, that maybe it's time for us to evaluate these two separately, but not for Philo. For Philo, they are one and the same. One results from the other, uh, and um, and that anxiety and fear that parents feel is a very real thing, right? The draw of a foreign culture comes along with the abandonment of Judaism, and marriage is a part of that. Okay, I'd like to introduce Paul for you. This is uh, hindsight, you're saying, what kind of Jewish source in this, right? In hindsight, you would be correct. In its day, Paul was a very Jewish source. And in the first book of Corinthians, he talks about how we take Jewish ideas and reform them, adopt them for this new religion, which has he talks about Judaism evolving from ethnos to ecclesia, from an ethnicity to a church. And thus, when he uses the word believer, he's talking about, if we were to make this a Jewish text, he would say Jew, right? But in Christianity, there is no such thing as Jew anymore. It's just believers and non believers. Now, it goes without saying that for Paul, it is best that a believer marries a believer, just like in the Jewish world, in the Jewish context, it is best that a Jew marries another Jew. But in this section of First Corinthians, he talks about what happens when a believer does not marry a believer. Right? Same, and again, Jewish context, when a Jew marries a non-Jew. And I want us to pay close attention to this because we're going to return to First Corinthians in a later source. Okay, Marcia, would you read for us from First Corinthians?
Okay. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her.
Now contrast that with Ezra and Nehemiah, who say, if you've married somebody who's not Jewish, you divorce her, right? Or send her out. But Paul says, you don't. You must not divorce her, your wife who is a non-believer.
And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him.
Right? Vice versa.
For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy.
So for Paul, what does he say, Marcia, about intermarriage?
Well, it's almost like as long as one of them believes, it's like it nullifies the fact that the other one doesn't believe.
That's right.
Considered holy.
It's obviously best if two believers marry each other. But from what we know about Christianity, Christianity is very different than Judaism in its movement away from the city to the world of faith and belief. Because Judaism has this goal of preserving the remnant, right? Everything that flows from the Aaronite priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, the language of preservation, hiding away from uncleanliness, the remnant. Those are the words we saw to define responsibility as Jews. Paul has a different goal in mind. Is he interested in preserving, or actually is he interested in a way in just the opposite? Not in preserving, but in spreading the gospel. Now, think about what would happen, folks, if Paul came about and said in this book, you should, Christians who've married foreigners, divorce them. What is that going to do to Christianity? Is that going to be a good thing for the long-term well-being and growth of the church? No way. If you divorce your wife or divorce your husband, what do you think that divorce party is going to think about Christianity? They're going to say, what an intolerant religion. Instead, Paul has a different solution. He's able to say, no. We are a religion of love, a religion of peace, a religion of tolerance, a religion of embracing. And if you're not Jewish, no problem. Even your children are sanctified through that believing parent. It's almost like for Paul, the low-hanging fruit, the lowest hanging fruit in the battle to expand the church are the non-believing husbands and wives. Why the heck would you want to send them away? They're the ones you should keep the closest. They're the ones you want to teach about Jesus to. They're the ones who are going to teach the children about faith. So I think this is fascinating because we're going to return to it later when we start asking questions about, well, what is our goal as Jews? It's true that preserving the remnant resonates very strongly with us, particularly in a post Holocaust world. When you have a non Jewish spouse who is supportive of raising the child in a Jewish way, I think that resonates with Paul's point of view, who says borders and boundaries actually don't preserve a religion, they destroy it. They just make the barriers thicker. That's what Paul, I think, might be trying to say in let's say, thinning in his new religion the boundaries between believer and non-believer. Keep them together. Everyone is holy. And if you're trying to build a religion, that's certainly a better, I don't know about you, but to me, I think it's a better strategy than Ezra and Nehemiah kicking out all the foreign wives and forcing people to divorce them. Remember, they also throw out the children, right? Get rid of the children too. But Ezra and Nehemiah used the language of preserving the sacred seed. That that does not resonate for Paul. There's no such thing for Paul. It's about believers and non-believers. Now it's 10:35, so we could start. We do have a bit of time to start sources. Let's just do the first one, okay? I think we'll have enough time to get there by quarter two, and then we'll have our discussion at quarter two. Now let's bring this to the time of the Mishnah. You all seem very happy this morning, and now I'm going to upset you. This is going to shock you because of everything we've learned previously. We've learned that many different attempts were made through sources in the Bible and sources in the Second Temple to interpret the Torah as forbidding intermarriage almost explicitly, right? And some of us are rooting for that. Yeah, it's there from the beginning. But the Mishnah teaches different. This is chapter 1, Mishnah Shabbat, Mishnah number 4, and we're going to read how the Talmud Yerushalmi understands this in the subsequent passage. And these are some of the regulations enacted in the attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Gurion when the rabbis went up to visit him. They called the roll and found that members of Beit Shammai outnumbered those of Beit Hillel, and they decreed 18 regulations on that day. So there were 18 decrees that were made in the attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah, and on that day, they were able to pass the decrees because, sometimes in Parliament, right? A couple of MPs don't show up, and suddenly the balance of the different political parties in the Parliament or in the House of Representatives, it changes. And the liberals get more and the conservatives get less, or vice versa, depending on who showed up that day. Well, that's what happened on this particular day. A few people got sick, didn't show up, and suddenly House of Shammai's students outnumbered those of the House of Hillel, and these 18 decrees, which were obviously a matter of some contention, were passed on that one day. Now, the Mishnah doesn't say what they were. For that, we need to turn to Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, edited in about the 4th or 5th century, and the Talmud Yerushalmi will tell us what those decrees were. Shirley Ann, would you read for us from Talmud Yerushalmi Masechet Shabbat?
It was taught. They made 18 decrees. They outnumbered them on 18, and they divided on 18. And these were the decrees: on Gentile bread, and on their cheese, and their oil, and their daughters, Rabbi Shimon.
Stop there for a second, okay? So these were the decrees: their bread, their cheese, their oil, and their daughters. And there were a few more that I left out here. The decrees passed on in that attic by the house of Shammai, right, were about separations. All had to do with separations from the culture around them. And that meant eating with them, buying their produce, some of their products, and their daughters. Now, what should upset you is this happened in the attic of who was it? Of Hananiah ben Chizkiah in the 2nd century? That's when this happened? I thought that the decree against their daughters came from at least Ezra and Nehemiah, or maybe even the Torah itself, according to the book of Jubilees. But this is the rabbinic tradition. That is, we're not reading books here anymore like Jubilees and Philo, which are outside of the canon of rabbinic Judaism, or Paul, for instance, who's certainly outside of the canon of rabbinic Judaism. We're now reading from the Mishnah, from the Talmud, and the Talmud says the prohibition on marrying non-Jews. It was actually a matter of contention between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, and they won on a particular day when the votes went in their favor, but it didn't happen until very late, until the rabbinic period. Keep going, Shirley Ann, this last passage here. Rabbi Shimon.
Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai taught, on that day, when Beit Shammai outnumbered Beit Hillel, they banned their bread, their cheese, their wine, their vinegar, their secretions, their brine, their marinades, their cooked foods, their salted foods, their language, their testimony, their gifts, their sons, their daughters.
So it happened not, at least according to here, it happened not in the Torah, not in the Second Temple period, not in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. It happened in some attic where votes were cast on these issues, which you can see here are all about mixing with the non-Jewish population, and we included in the limitations of that mixing marriage between their sons and their daughters. Now look at this next section here. I'll read it for you. Their daughters, said Rabbi Elazar, in 7 places it is written, do not marry them. So Rabbi Elazar is saying, hold on. Actually, it doesn't say it in 7 places, but in rabbinic literature, that's a way of saying, it's so clear in the Torah. How can you say that that prohibition came about in the attic that day? It says in the Torah, lo titchatein bam, do not marry them. But what is Rabbi Abin's answer? He says that only forbids the 7 nations who were indigenous to the land of Israel. So, folks, now we're seeing this come a little bit full circle. Rabbi Abin says, no, officially speaking, the Torah only forbids marriage to the 7 Canaanite nations. But a ban on intermarriage, period, does not come about until the days of Rabbi Chizkiah. Rabbi Yehoshua Onaya taught it comes to forbid their eggs. Now, he doesn't buy it, he disagrees. If you notice, when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, all of the 18 prohibitions that he mentions are food, right? Or almost all of them. Their vinegar, their secretions, their brine, their marinades. So he says it comes to forbid their eggs. What's he talking about? Comes to forbid their eggs. So according to Rabbi Yoshua Onaya, when it says their sons and their daughters, that's a euphemism for beitzehen, their eggs. I guess because, eggs are the children of the chickens. I don't buy that. I mean, you can buy that if you'd like to, but what Rabbi Yoshua Onaya is basically saying is, I am shocked by this crazy notion that the prohibition against intermarriage didn't pre-exist the days of Rabbi Chizkiah's edict. I am shocked. So I will reinterpret the 18 decrees and say that no, intermarriage wasn't included among the 18 decrees. It was actually their eggs along with other cooked foods. So this is an aggravating source in our discussion, right? Suddenly, everything that we've read boils down to it. These actually were not decrees, official prohibitions. What were Ezra and Nehemiah doing? Telling people they weren't allowed to marry non-Jewish women? Well, they were dealing with the circumstances of their time. The circumstances of their time demanded a very stern approach, a very firm approach against intermarriage, but they were decreeing that only for their time and their generation. An all-encompassing prohibition against intermarriage falls into the same category, according to the Talmud, as Gentile testimony, as Gentile cheese. How many of you eat Kraft cheese? Well, guess what? Those of you who eat Kraft cheese, well, you may as well be marrying non-Jews, right? It's in the same category of we need to separate ourselves. We need thicker boundaries between Jews and non-Jews. And let's come up with some ideas of how we can do that. Here are 18 ways that we can make boundaries between ourselves and the culture surrounding us, and we'll include intermarriage among them. Does that aggravate any of you? It aggravates me. Throws out everything almost that we've spent the past 2 or 3 weeks studying and starts all from the beginning, all over from the beginning. No, before it was just people acting out of intuition. The real comprehensive decree does not come about until the rabbinic era, which is very, very late, my friends. When thinking about how a people preserves itself over centuries, you're telling me that there really wasn't a ban against intermarriage until the rabbinic era? Well, we have more to discuss. You'll see that this becomes you see from Yehoshua ben Onaya's reinterpretation, dramatic, almost crazy reinterpretation of no, it can't be. Daughters and sons means they're eggs. What he's saying is it can't be. It can't be that intermarriage was banned in some attic on a day when a few people got sick and didn't show up for the vote. Right? Such an important decree that changes Judaism forever. It happened by accident? Can't be. They were talking about their eggs. Obviously the male eggs and the female eggs, right? Their sons and their daughters. Don't ask me. I don't write this stuff. I just teach it. But it's one of the things I love about Talmud study is trying to figure out what these sages meant, how they came to believe what they believe, and what really is at the heart of their disagreement. So I leave today's class with, I leave you in suspense with this argument, right? How are we supposed to make sense of the Mishnah's assertion, and what does the Talmud do with it? All right.